Well, good morning to everyone. This is our quarterly legal forum. You're all very welcome to join us this morning. So this morning we'll be looking at the regulatory landscape for life sciences as it continues to evolve rapidly. We've got technological advancement within the sector. We've got sort of big changes within the world, societal changes, which sort of impacts the regulatory landscape. And this morning, we'll be looking at sort of current issues as they relate to both medicines and medical devices, and also thinking around landscaping and what may be coming down the line. I'm delighted to have a broad range of regulatory experts on the call this morning. So both Mills and Reeve regulatory team and some of our friends within the industry on the regulatory side. We will deliberately keep things reasonably high level. Regulation is so broad. We'll break it into two in terms of medicines and devices, and we've got specific sort of tag teams looking at the different products. We thought that what we would do, just to sort of marshal discussions, is sort of just to break down today into discrete parts. So we'll look first at clinical development and clinical trials. We'll look at accelerated pathways for both medicines and medical devices. We'll look at the whole piece in terms of how digital and new technologies is impacting particularly the medical device space, but also sort of the impacts on medicines and clinical trials in particular. AI, we may get into quantum, etc. Looking at broader regulation and how that's interlinking with product regulatory issues. And then we'll do that horizon scanning. We've obviously got a new government thinking around their priorities in this space. Keen that we get straight to it. We've got quite a bit to cover. Please do raise questions as we go. We'll either deal with them there and then, but we've also got time at the end just to deal with Q&A. Sarah in our marketing team will send you a sort of a feedback form at the end, which allows you also to suggest topics for future events. As I say, this is our quarterly series of legal forums. Before we get to it, I'm keen just to introduce the panel here today. So Isabel, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Isabel Teare. I'm in the Mills Reeve Life Sciences team, specialising in regulatory and commercial work.
Thank you, Isabel. Steph?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Steph Caird. I'm a partner in Mills and Reeve's Life Sciences team. I specialise in commercial IP and regulatory work with a focus area on medtech and medical devices.
Thank you, Steph. Kevin?
Everyone, yeah, my name's Kevin Judges. I work at DLRC. We're a regulatory consultancy with offices in the UK, Germany, and the US.
Thank you, Kevin. And Tim?
Good morning. I am Tim Bubb. I am Technical Director at iMed Consultancy, and we're a consultancy which works in the medical devices, IVD, companion diagnostics, and device drug combination product space.
Thank you, Tim. So an esteemed panel today, broad range of skills and knowledge. So as I say, happy to sort of answer questions as we go. But let's get going with the discussion. The first thing I wanted to touch on was really around clinical development and clinical trials in particular. So maybe if I turn to Isabel first, really just to kick things off and sort of to start to talk about some of those key issues, key regulatory issues in this space.
Well, there were two areas I thought it would be worth looking at in the clinical development area for pharmaceuticals. We've got the EU clinical trials regulation now well into its transition phase, having taken effect in 22, and the transition period will come to an end January 25, by which time ongoing clinical trials must have moved over to the regulation system and the new information system. It is improving apparently, and I understand that some of those early teething problems are getting better, but issues are still being highlighted around some problems with slow approval processes, increased document burden, and so not quite as streamlined as had been initially hoped. And for example, if there's a need for a change, a modification, for example, new sites or change of principal investigator, then some have highlighted issues with delays by getting all relevant member states to approve of the application before that modification can come through, and some technical hurdles have been highlighted. So I suppose the message there is, although the system is bedding in and improving, that there are still some issues with it. So you need, if anything, to be really well prepared and allow time for things like modifications to move through. And the second area I thought would be worth looking at was with innovative products and how those don't necessarily fit neatly into the model for clinical trials regulation. So with advanced therapy medicinal products, for example, where you have perhaps small numbers of suitable patients, long duration required for evidence gathering, that although regulators are sort of keen to progress those innovative products, it can be difficult to build the clinical trial evidence package in the normal way. And so now there's increasing emphasis on real world data, real world evidence, and regulators are thinking about how during the early life of the product, that evidence can be gathered to support the initial package that was put together for the initial approval. It's interesting to see, actually, while regulators around the world have got some slightly different approaches on real world data, there is an effort at ICH international collaboration level where regulators are trying to work together to coordinate the kinds of real world evidence that they accept, and how to make that really consistent and internationally consistent, as well as within each country. So yeah, those are the two areas I thought it'd be worth highlighting. But Kevin, perhaps you could add to that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Isabel. I mean, I think, you correctly point out about the requirement to transition to CTR. So, I mean, actually, in practice, that really means that if companies haven't yet submitted that, they really need to submit in the next couple of weeks, according to the guidelines. So that's something that really, needs to be looked at immediately if you have got clients that haven't yet transitioned. I think the other thing we're seeing, although to some extent, and there are some delays, that the assessment timelines, it's a bit easier to plan than under the old directive, where questions would come in at random times. What we're seeing is, because of the short turnaround for questions, around 12 days, a number of our clients struggle to meet those timelines. So again, as you flag, Isabel, planning around responses, etc., is absolutely critical to meet those timelines. I think the other thing we see is around the legal representation under clinical trial regulation. That is something that has a lot more onus on it than under the directive. It is something that we do within the DLRC group out of our German office. So as the legal representative, you really have almost similar requirements as the sponsor. So you really need to make sure you've got all those processes in place to oversee the study if you are acting as the legal representative. And then the other challenge that we see is, and again, you sort of mentioned it a little bit around the modifications, because actually there are limited time slots for these per year, only 4. So you really need to plan around modifications. So if you've got an IB amendment ongoing, for example, and suddenly you need to do you want to do a substantial amendment on the protocol, you might not actually be able to submit that immediately because you've got other things pending. So again, it all comes down to planning to make sure that you can execute your study according to the way in which you wish. And I think the other thing we're seeing, and actually we're working a little bit with the EMA on this, is that the CTIS has had quite a lot of issues, and EMA are looking at trying to improve that and simplify the process. So if you're not experienced at using CTIS, it is a bit of a nightmare to navigate for a new user. So that again is something that companies need to plan for, to make sure they've got the right people in place and trained. And then also the other thing we see that some companies are not aware of is that you also need to make sure that all the other systems are set up, such as Vigilance, and XEV, MPD, etc., are all that you're set up on those, because all the systems talk to each other. So these are the sort of things that we see on the CTR side. I think again you mentioned.
Kevin, do you just want to mention what CTIS is very quickly?
It's the Clinical Trial Information System. Yeah. So that's really the portal through which all the documentation goes as you submit under the clinical trial regulation. And I think with the advanced therapies, obviously the review times there can be extended quite significantly by 50 days over normal medicinal products. And then the other challenge that we're helping companies with when it comes to the GMO advanced therapies is the environmental requirements on top of the clinical trial requirements, and these are still very much nationally governed. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that again when it comes to horizon scanning, but currently they're nationally governed, so that again and the requirements and the procedures vary across countries, so that again does bring some challenges and potentially extends the timelines to actually get the first patient in the study. So yeah, I think there's some of the the things we're seeing when it comes to the CTR implementation.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to sustainability and environmental, as you say, on horizon scanning. So you see, we've got two tag teams. We've got Kevin and Isabel focused on medicines. We've got Steph and Tim focusing on devices. So maybe if we go into the clinical investigation side of things in terms of med devices, and maybe if I ask sort of Steph to start and then Tim to add.
Thanks, James. I was going to pick up on Kevin's comment about planning being critical in the pathway, and the same goes for medical devices. But because medical devices is a really broad church where you have some devices that are classified in a way that you can self-certify to your class 3s that are fairly invasive devices, a clinical investigation might not always be needed in order to get your device to market. So the first step in the process of working out whether you think you need an investigation to start with in order to evidence the efficacy of your product, and then if you do determine that that is necessary, you need to make sure that you make appropriate notifications to the MHRA, so Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and also relevant research ethics committees, and bear in mind that there are timelines before you can then start your clinical investigation. So the general rule is you have to notify 60 days in advance of start. If there are any issues that crop up in that notification process, it might be delayed slightly. And that rule around the clinical investigations doesn't just apply to your physical devices, so your hardware, but it would also be applicable where you have apps and software as a medical device which you have decided does need a clinical investigation. What is helpful is that the MHRA is collaborating with the Health Research Authority on a coordinated pathway for these, which allows the two of them to share information with each other during the assessment process. But in order to qualify, you have to make the submission to the MHRA first and then go via the Research Ethics Committee approval. And then the other quirky bit to bear in mind with medical devices is if you have a combined device and medicine, and there is now a new part of IRAS which allows a single application for both the clinical trial of an IMP and a device review. But all of those things going back to Kevin's point, are things to consider at the outset of your journey. And I'll pass over to Tim, because I know he's got some additional things to say, particularly around devices that use AI.
Yes. So I'd like to really say that clinical development plans here, so your strategy for how you're going to generate clinical evidence for your medical device, is really, really important. So considering the classification of your product and also what jurisdictions and markets you're looking to go into as well. So if we consider FDA and US approvals, you can go through a pre-submission route to say, FDA, we're thinking about doing a clinical investigation for the product. Here is our trial design. Do you agree with that in terms of generating the necessary regulatory evidence? You can also look to put your clinical development plan to certain notified bodies as part of your initial application for MDR. They can't give you any consultation advice back, but you can potentially take a look at speaking with the notified body and getting some indicative judgment on whether it's sufficient or not. And that can really help you in terms of calibrating to make sure you are going to generate the right evidence for your regulatory submissions. There's been very much an increasing focus on generating clinical evidence in medical devices, particularly with the more recent EU regulations. And we're going to see hopefully new regulations in the UK next year, which are very much going to align with the European current regulations. So looking for additional enhanced levels of clinical evidence for medical devices. So when we think about that and what the implications of that are, if you have existing medical devices on the market, now is the time to start taking a look at, do we have sufficient levels of clinical data for our medical devices to transition to the new UK regulations and certification to the current EU regulations? Because we're currently coming through the middle part of the transition period in Europe. And there are a lot of medical device companies which are now certified, but also equally as many that are not certified and are going to be going through that certification process to the new regulations in the coming years. AI devices are also a consideration here. So particularly if we think about the US, generally the 510K route for a class 2 medical device doesn't often require clinical evidence. But when we think of AI medical devices, quite often FDA are expecting there to be prospective independent validation through a clinical investigation, quite often in the USA. So consideration around your clinical development plans here are really, really important. And particularly with FDA being able to speak to the regulator to confirm your plans and the appropriateness of those plans is a really useful thing that you can do. Thinking about MHRA, there are potentially going to be some significant fee increases coming in next year. So there is a consultation currently available on those. And there are various other fee increases that are currently being proposed also for the pharma and biotechnology space. So I would recommend people take a look through those and perhaps think about whether they want to have any company representations around the impacts of those fees, because they are potentially going to be quite high compared to what they currently are.
Okay, no, thank you. I'm hearing planning an awful lot. I'm hearing you need to look at all this holistically, whether medicines and devices, and it's also an area where it's watch this space. Perhaps we can now move on to accelerated pathways, and I'd like to sort of cover medicines first and then devices. So perhaps I can turn to Kevin really just to set the scene and maybe talk about some of those key pathways for medicines.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. I mean, there are quite a few, so I will need to be quite brief. So really, these really apply to products that are looking to treat, a life-threatening or seriously debilitating diseases, and therefore, going to provide potentially significant benefits. So within Europe, I'm sure everyone's heard of the PRIME scheme, the Priority Medicines scheme with the EMA, which is a European-wide scheme. And that is something, where you get an early rapporteur assignment, which does help. You can then have ongoing discussions throughout the development. So it's more of an enhanced scientific advice dialogue you have with the EMA and the rapporteur around the development, both clinical, non-clinical, CMC, whatever, the particular issues for the program might be. So that is something that you know, a lot of companies are keen to get. I think from our experience, again, it's a resource one, because especially for smaller companies, it is quite resource intensive, because you have more meetings, you have more briefing books to pull together. You're often, the company is also probably looking at US breakthrough as well, and enhanced interaction on the FDA side. And all this can come, you know, sort of a little bit in parallel. So certainly companies need to look at the planning again there, to make sure that they've got the resources and external support, etc., in place to really help them navigate that. The other thing in Europe that we've helped companies with is the Innovation Task Force. They can be very useful meetings when you've got really, you know, novel technologies. It can be, you know, a broader discussion, not just on a particular product, but on a technology. It's more informal discussion. You don't get sort of formal advice, as it were. So that can be very helpful for companies perhaps developing novel excipients, or, you know, complicated combination type products. So that's something that we've you know, found to be quite beneficial. And then obviously there are the more accelerated assessment and conditional marketing authorization routes open in Europe again, which, you know, can help get your product to the market faster. But obviously with a conditional approval, then that comes with specific obligations that you have to fulfill. I'll perhaps skip over the UK, because I think, Isabel, you might be talking a little bit about ILAP and things. We do have some experience there, so if there are questions, I can perhaps chime in there. And then on the US side, you know, again, there's the fast track designation that you can get, which supports rolling reviews, so, and more frequent FDA interactions, and obviously breakthrough designation as well. Again, it's something that companies are keen to obtain. And then there's the equivalent for ATMPs on the regenerative medicines side as well. And again, it's all around enhanced dialogue with the FDA, and sort of commitment from the FDA to you know, to support the developer during the review and IND process.
We're often asked, Kevin, about sort of the proactivity or reactivity of regulators. What's your sense on that? Is the FDA sort of leading the way in terms of being far more proactive as a regulator? Is that your sense?
Well, I think following the pandemic, there were clearly issues with getting, yeah, the timelines were extended everywhere. You know, when you wanted to interact with agencies, unless obviously it was related to COVID, you know, treatments, etc., and vaccines. Things are definitely improving, but I think, you know, there's still a lot of written advice on both sides of the pond. You don't see as many face-to-face meetings as, you know, pre-pandemic, although again, I think that is improving. But yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately in general the FDA is a little bit more proactive at the moment, but I think, you know, there are efforts being made. I think both in the UK we've seen improvements with the MHRA performance as well, in terms of you know, review of clinical trials, timelines coming back down to more expected timeframes. So I think, you know, there are efforts everywhere to try and be as proactive as possible.
Great, fantastic. Isabel, can I bring you in then on UK?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin. And as Kevin has indicated, you know, regulators are under a lot of resourcing pressure, but we see that putting real emphasis and focus on bringing forward those innovative products and those that are addressing unmet needs. And there are these programs around the different regulators to do that. So the UK one that we wanted to mention is the UK ILAP program with the Innovation Passport application, and there are various criteria to qualify for that. So notably a life-threatening or seriously debilitating condition, or significant patient or public health need in an innovative area particularly. And I wanted to highlight a recent example where that has operated in practice. So Vertex Pharmaceuticals Casgevy was approved in the UK first. This is the first CRISPR-based therapy, and it's gaining approval in different jurisdictions, but the UK used the iLab scheme to get this through very quickly. This is a treatment with gene editing of bone marrow cells, and achieved authorization based on 2 fairly small number clinical trials, and these managed to reach the primary efficacy interim analysis quite quickly and gained approval at the end of 2023. So that's really exciting. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that working in practice, and the clinical trials remain ongoing with the collection of ongoing data to support the initial authorizations.
Great, fantastic. Maybe we'll move on to devices and bring Tim into the discussion. So can you maybe sort of talk about some of those key issues in the device space, and I'll move on to Steph.
Yes. So if we consider accelerated pathways for medical devices, they actually quite closely mirror medicines in this space. So for example, in the USA, we've got breakthrough device designation as a potential option that you could look to pursue. To be able to be eligible for that, again, you need to be looking at a medical device which solves a key critical problem within the healthcare space and is an innovative solution for that. And typically it's products which are looking at debilitating conditions or life-threatening conditions for which there's not currently a really suitable standard of care, and looking to progress and put something in place where currently something doesn't exist, or what exists is not optimized. And having that breakthrough device designation gives you access to FDA to have a much more collaborative discussion through the assessment and regulatory process to make sure any regulatory hurdles that you come up against, you can work through with the regulator to get a judgment on what is sufficient for that breakthrough product to be able to gain regulatory approval. If we think about the UK, we've spoken about iLab. There is a similar scheme currently in pilot within the UK called IDAP, the Innovative Device Access Pathway. So this is currently ongoing as a pilot, which is closed. There are 8 medical device manufacturers which are currently testing the system, going through that process and seeing how does it work, looking to fine tune. And hopefully we will see, again, with the new UK medical device regulations, an ability to use this pathway as a pathway which becomes accessible to all potential applicants with breakthrough technologies. We've also had from the MHRA a publication this week of a new AI airlock pilot. So specifically taking a look at artificial intelligence-based medical devices, or devices which contain artificial intelligence, and looking at where there's a regulatory problem around having artificial intelligence included within your product, and perhaps gathering your clinical data, your clinical evidence in a way that fits within clinical trial paradigms, or perhaps is challenged by that. This airlock is potentially able to get you earlier access into the healthcare system within a closely guarded area, which allows you to demonstrate and test your technology, to iterate it and develop it, but in a way which is safe and effective and overseen by the regulators. So that's potentially quite an exciting area, which will be available to people in the coming years, but also there's a pilot that's available now, which closes in 2 weeks' time. So if you're interested, now's the time to apply.
Okay, wonderful. And you mentioned AI a few times, and other panelists have. And maybe we move to the next theme and talk about digital and advanced technologies and how they're impacting this space. And maybe if I turn to Steph, really, just to kick off in terms of this theme, and to maybe just set the scene around regulatory approach to date, Steph, around AI technologies in this space.
Yeah, thanks, James. So as everyone probably knows, use of AI and machine learning is already here in the medical device spaces. It's really prevalent in things like radiology, particularly in oncology, where you can use algorithms to help clinicians with the diagnosis of early stage cancers, particularly where the tumours are so small that to the naked eye they might be barely visible. So AI is already here. It's a big buzzword generally, even outside of the medicines and med device stage, and it is recognised by both the government and the regulator that it's here to stay, but it also will offer us an opportunity to improve the efficiency in our health services. The MHRA has always indicated that they are intending to take a risk proportionate approach. So they will look at how the AI and machine learning is going to be used in the context of the products. And it's already got a number of resources in place for software, including AI as a medical device. So you've got good machine learning practice, change control plans for machine learning enabled devices. Tim's also mentioned the airlock that's going on at the moment. So I think one of the biggest areas which is often discussed in this space is how we are going to look at putting in place guardrails for AI and machine learning, because as things go along, and as we see with AI enabled, so Gen AI, we have issues around black box decision makings. How can you explain what's been happening? The regulators are increasingly publishing new laws and guidance. So we've got the EU AI Act, which I know Tim is going to talk about. Then there's the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill that's making its way through our systems at the moment. And then at EU level, we also have 2 NIS directives, which are all about cybersecurity. And all of those things together are likely going to start impacting the developers of medicines and medical devices, because you not only have to take into account your regulatory pathway for your device, but also the ancillary regulation that's going on around data protection, AI regulation, and cybersecurity. And I think I'd like to hand over to Tim to talk a bit more about what we're seeing in the AI space here.
Yes, thank you very much, Steph. So the EU AI Act has very recently been published. It's now entered into force. So we're now looking at transition timelines. So if you are a medical device manufacturer who is looking to have an AI or machine learning component within your product, or currently has one within your product, the time is now to take a look at what the implications of the AI Act are. So you need to be taking a look at what the implications are to your quality management system. There'll be new processes that you need to put in place, new governance structures that you need to consider, new ways of collecting and considering the data used to train your AI algorithms. All of this will need to be considered as how you do it in a structured methodological way. And this will then also form part of the notified body, EU notified body assessments of both the systems and the product. So we see at the moment notified bodies are, in a lot of cases, competent in assessing AI, but they have different ways of assessing AI. And with the introduction of the AI Act, there are now going to be consistent kind of formulaic areas in which they will need to assess going forwards. So we should see an element of harmonization in terms of what notified bodies assess and what they require to see as part of that assessment process. So key thing here, transition timelines are different depending upon what stage of development you're in and whether you've got a product on the market at present or not. So take a look into those. One of the other interesting impacts of the AI Act is that potentially some digital health products which are used in healthcare but are not medical devices actually become notified body regulated products. So if we think about things like systems which are used to triage access to healthcare services, they may not be a medical device per legislation definitions, but they may come under being what's called a high-risk AI system because they're using AI tools to make decisions which could impact health of people. And that potentially takes those products into being regulated as an AI product, but not a medical device. So an interesting area to take a look into and see if you are in that digital health space, particularly electronic healthcare records or triaging systems, what the impacts of this act will be.
Great. Fantastic. Should should we maybe move over into the medicine space then and just sort of talk? I mean, it's obviously, I think we're talking about AI app principally going to impact medical devices. So a lot of the weight is on that side of the fence when it comes to life sciences. But there are clearly some things going on in relation to the medicine space as well. And Isabel, can you talk to those, please?
Yeah, there's clearly a lot of excitement around using AI and machine learning in lots of areas, such as target identification and validation, and prediction of a drug candidate's properties in use. So prediction of toxicity profile, for example, and then data integration and analysis. There's excitement around how you bring together huge fields of data and identify possible links between a condition and a candidate. So a lot of excitement in the whole tech bio space at the moment. So we can see people deploying these kind of technologies in their drug development process, also around optimizing clinical trial design. But in contrast to devices, these kind of technologies are further away from the clinic. And so at the moment, there are some ethical concerns around things like populations and whether there's a proper reflection of diversity in a population, for example. But people at the moment don't feel an immediate need to look at regulating for pharmaceuticals. That is likely to change as technologies move forward and the possible impact on patients becomes more apparent. But at the moment, it's sort of a little bit further away from the patient and the clinic. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Kevin.
No, I mean, I agree. I think, in terms of our experience where we've, been involved, we've been involved on the device side with AI. On the medicinal side, it is more on the drug discovery side, I think, where, companies are using AI to hopefully, shorten that whole process. And yeah, I think any other use later on is still, from our experience at least, quite exploratory at this point. And as with, often in the case with the, regulatory affairs and guidance, I think, that sort of needs to perhaps start to catch up a little bit in, to help companies to provide the framework to ensure that we are, utilizing AI advantages where at all possible.
Absolutely. And we've also got quantum coming down the line as well, but maybe we get onto that later on. But Steph, I think you just wanted to add a supplementary point.
Yeah, there's just also, as well as the AI side of things for medicines, there's been some debate since the introduction of NIS2, which is the Network and Information Security 2 directive at EU level, because that suggests that it's quite possible that by running clinical trials, medicines developers will be caught by the requirements in terms of cybersecurity systems, and potentially caught as an essential provider, which means that their kind of level of compliance and scrutiny will be much higher than some others. But because it's a directive, we're going to have to wait for national implementing legislation across the European Union, and there might then be some differences, but that's a kind of watch this space on. If you are doing clinical trials in the European Union, you might also have to have additional cybersecurity measures in place.
No, thank you. There's an awful lot going on. I mean, if anyone has any questions as we go, please do feed those through the Q&A, or we can always deal with sort of follow up questions after the session. Maybe if we want to move on to the next theme I wanted to discuss, which is really around thinking through the broader regulatory landscape and how it interlinks with a lot of these product regulatory issues we've already been talking about. So by way of example, data privacy, but there's obviously a whole range of other frameworks that we need to be thinking about. And this goes to that sort of thinking about things holistically, not just focusing on the product, but also what else impacts. And maybe if I ask Tim to to start here on the device side?
Yes, so particularly if we think about medical devices can be many different products. We can go from a substance-based medical device to an MRI scanner to a wound care product. There are lots of potential horizontal product legislation to consider for your medical device. So if we focus on electronic products, we're going to need to be considering component legislation for things like electronic waste, batteries, machinery, things like that, as part of your regulatory strategy, and compliance to those requirements are quite often assessed as part of the notified body assessment of the medical device as the primary legislation, with then the horizontal legislation having an element of assessment within that regulatory review by a notified body. We also need to consider here things like general data protection regulations and data privacy. We see an increasing focus on cybersecurity in really all jurisdictions at the moment. People may be aware of certain hacks of medical devices and of medical systems within hospitals, which have caused unavailability of medical devices for things like diagnostic decisions for patients, which really impacts upon the efficiency and the safety of the healthcare system. So, for instance, FDA have quite recently released new cybersecurity regulations, and they're now requesting far more detailed information on their cybersecurity posture of a medical device, of a companion diagnostic, and the methods also for maintaining that cybersecurity posture following regulatory clearance. So they're not just asking about what the product is now, but how are you going to keep the product safe from a cybersecurity perspective into the future?
Right. Maybe I bring in Steph, I think, just to sort of add to some of those other issues that need to be thought around, because there's a lot going on.
So thanks, James and Tim. I mean, I'm going to expand on Tim's nod to data privacy, because there's also going to be things like, particularly if you've got AI-enabled devices, consider your issues around automated decision-making rules that you need to comply with at both UK and EU GDPR level, particularly around making sure you're transparent with users of those devices, that is what is happening with your data. And then for new technologies, you also need to always bear in mind the need for data privacy impact assessments. So don't forget those things in amongst all the other medical device regs that you need to wade through. And then even when you've got a product through all of your regulatory hurdles and you're marketing it, you need to start thinking about how you will market it, because for devices, you might have a product that is targeted directly at consumers. And then you have your advertising rules that you need to comply with, which are enforced by the Advertising Standards Agency here in the UK. They have got a lot hotter on enforcement around medical claims that are made in advertising, particularly in the space of femtech and things like menopause products. So you need to be careful how you couch your marketing claims, but also if you haven't got a medical device but you are making claims that it has a medicinal or medical properties, then you might end up falling into medical device regulatory territory. So it goes both ways with your advertising claims. And then the other area that is going to be increasingly relevant for direct-to-consumer products, particularly if you've got app-based products, will be the DMCC, which is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers rules. And that is going to be relevant for direct-to-consumer subscription-based commercialization models. So if you have an app that is behind a paywall in order for you to access functionalities where you pay on a monthly basis, there are now going to be additional requirements that you need to share with the users before they sign up. In order for that to be enforceable, you need to give them opt-out rights, cancellation rights, etc. And if you get it wrong, your fines are in the similar kind of ballpark as fines under GDPR. So the scope for getting things, if things go wrong, it is kind of, it is more risky now that that's in place.
I suppose that goes to the final point around re-regulatory strategy. You're not just looking at the product, you're looking at all the stuff going on, but then you're looking at all the way through the life cycle. So taking it into commercialization and how your commercialization models are going to impact from a regulatory perspective. Can I turn to Isabel just in terms of a wrap up on medicines? And I think, Isabel, you again wanted to focus on some of the enforcement activity within the medicines promotion space.
Yeah, Steph has mentioned where you've got products that are directed to consumers, then we're seeing an uptick in enforcement focus there. Steph mentioned claims around, for example, menopause, and we're seeing there are some sort of products that are presented as herbal supplements, for example, around that area of health support. And the Advertising Standards Authority is beginning to question, those kind of medicinal claims there, and saying, well, are you appropriately classifying this product if you're making claims like that? And then another area where you've got promotion of pharmaceuticals to a healthcare audience, we're seeing an uptick also in enforcement activity under the ABPI code, for example. So where you've got promotion of products in an innovative way, there's a series of case law coming through around promotion of medicines in a kind of social media context. So you can have online webinars presented to a physician audience, and sort of influential speakers giving talks and sponsoring of pharmacies to get involved in that. And those kind of novel promotional methods are receiving quite a degree of attention, especially in a space where a product might be promoted almost towards a consumer audience, like the new wave of weight loss medications. There's a particular issue there around promoting to a consumer audience, and that being an inappropriate form of promotion. So while innovative marketing is of course going to be an increasing trend, you have to take great care around keeping in line with those rules around promotion of those products.
Absolutely. I think we've been doing some of the horizon scanning as we've gone on, and maybe if we now move to looking at some of the other things sort of going on that are coming down the line, and sort of wrapping up discussion. So I do want to go to medicines first, and then devices. So maybe if I come back to you, Isabel, just to pick up on that. So maybe talk around where some of those government priorities are, but then some of those key changes. I know you wanted to mention EU pharma package as well, and then Kevin, I think, will pick up in terms of some of the stuff going on around HTA changes as well.
Yeah, there's a whole reform of the European pharmaceuticals legislation going on at the moment, which people may well be aware of. Lots of new initiatives within that. It's under development at the moment, and it's being altered as it goes through, but there's efforts being made to drive certain behaviors, so driving improved environmental sustainability around medicines, for example, trying to promote supply across the whole of the EU using regulatory data protection systems, and tying that together with market access. Efforts around antimicrobial resistance and tackling that, and use of regulatory sandboxes as a specific system within the new legislation. So, as I say, that's in progress, but it's worth watching how that legislation develops in the process.
Fantastic. Kevin, do you want to touch on HTA?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of other things. I mean, I completely agree with Isabel. I mean, we've done this for a few clients. I think, companies really need to look at the new regulation and assess what it means for their portfolio coming through, because there are potentially, you know, some quite significant changes that could, yeah, both positively but also potentially negatively impact, you know, their portfolio. A couple of things that I wanted to pick up still on the pharma reg is perhaps a bit of good news, I think, because I mentioned earlier about some of the, you know, national differences around the assessment of genetically modified products when it comes to the environmental risk assessment. There is a proposal to centralise this under the new regulations, so that I think would be helpful, and that includes actually the assessment of the investigational medicinal product dossier for these products as well. So I think that's something that would help. And then the other interesting thing that you know, is proposed is the more involvement of patients and healthcare providers in the regulatory system. So, for example, there will be actually 4 representatives each from those groups proposed on the CHMP, and also a couple on the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. So I think that will be interesting to see how that plays into the dynamics of those committees. Certainly, I attended a scientific advice where there was a patient representative there, and they certainly brought a quite, I would say, unique perspective to that discussion, which was you know, very interesting to observe. And then, yes, on the HTA regulation, again, I won't go into too much detail, but you know, people should be aware that this is coming next year and it will be obligatory for all oncology products that go through the centralised and ATMPs, etc. So that is something that you really need to look into, because that process will run in parallel to the MAA, and will include some of the documents that are in the MAA. So the clinical overview and the SMPC will be provided initially as part of that process, and then further down the line, there's then this a report required on the sort of clinical utility of your product that the developer will need to prepare. So that's sort of an additional document. But I think, you know, the planning around that is now needed, because, you know, this is coming in January, and then it will be phased in for orphans in 2028, and then eventually for all products in the centralised procedure by 2030. So again, you know, if you're looking at preparing a dossier for next year, then you know, these activities and considerations need to be taken into account now. And there's one final thing which I know wasn't on our list, but I think it's maybe something on the US side, and this is the FDA Diversity Action Plan. I don't know if people are aware of this, but this actually impacts IDEs as well as new drugs and biologics. There's a draft guidance out that FDA issued. So again, have a look at that. But it basically means that there will be a requirement for most products. There are waivers, but probably, you know, limited number there to ensure that your pivotal studies represent the diversity across sex, race, ethnicity, age, etc., to ensure that you really are representing the overall, you know, to be treated target population. So that is something I think that you know, needs to be on the radar, and you know, keep that in the back of your minds as well for you know, if you're looking at starting up later stage studies, perhaps again next year.
Absolutely. And we don't have time to deal with it today, but there's also things like Inflation Reduction Act within the US, which is impacting product development. We've actually got some sort of separate sessions around that, and notes if anyone wants that in terms of how it's impacting. But maybe if I turn now in terms of the horizon scanning piece to Steph, then Tim, to talk about what's on the radar in relation to devices. So maybe if I turn to Steph first and then Tim. We've got a question in, and I'm keen that we just go back to Steph just to answer that one, because that's her wheelhouse. But maybe Steph, if you go first.
Yeah, thank you. I'll leave Tim to talk about recognition procedures internationally. So the Labour government has indicated that reform of medical devices and the NHS is a priority for them. They are planning to introduce plans that will deal with a range of topics such as procurement of products for the NHS, giving a clearer route to get products into the NHS, including with technology. There is a huge drive to bring new technologies into the NHS and to also create syndicated data centres, because with AI and machine learning, your outputs are only as good as your data inputs. So we're trying to coordinate that and remove silos. I'm part of the Tech UK Life Sciences Working Group that has been feeding in to the government from industry and other stakeholders to manage those data environments more efficiently, so that we can benefit in the research space from data that is already in our NHS. So we've got that coming, and I'll leave Tim to talk about international recognition processes.
Yes, so I think in terms of international recognition, this also comes back to the new UK devices regulatory system as well. So generally speaking, that new system is aligning much more closely with the current EU regulations, which of course pre-Brexit MHRA were a big part of generating that new regulatory framework. And at a high level, that's really strengthening requirements all round. So more assessment of quality management systems, more assessment of the product, more assessment of the clinical data for that product as well. One of the other potential things that might be going to those new regulations, and we're still thinking about it in terms of kind of this is potential policy, which may go into future regulations, but is still a little bit unclear on the specifics, is around the possibility for international recognition routes in the UK using other reference markets. So this is a big theme of one of the big international agencies, the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. And that's multiple regulators around the world, of which MHRA is a member of. And one of the things that's being looked at within that group, and MHRA is taking cues off, is what's called recognition and reliance principles. So those are being developed as a way of potentially using a reference agency, for example, FDA, to use as the basis for their system has certain requirements to it. If they've assessed it and found it to be suitable, we need to do a abridged assessment of the differences between our system, or perhaps even not need to do an assessment because safety has been demonstrated and performance has been demonstrated in a reference agency, and we are happy as a regulatory authority to accept that regulator's review of the product. So that's a potentially quite interesting area in terms of being able to leverage, both in the UK and also potentially other countries, regulatory approvals in one market going into other areas.
Fantastic. I mean, I think we'll probably see more regulatory cooperation more generally. So again, it's watch this space. Maybe I'll turn to Steph just in terms of the question that's come in and before we wrap up. So really quickly, just to read it out: if a connected device being used for research use only in the UK or EU also collects patient data via a mobile app as part of the research, do we still have to comply with any regs relating to digital data, cybersecurity, etc., or is the entire package considered RUO and assume the regs relating to products placed on the market fall away, at least to some extent? Steph?
I think the short answer is, unfortunately, you still have to comply with related regs. So the regimes around data protection, cybersecurity, etc., are completely separate to the medical device regulatory or medicines regulatory regimes. So as soon as you're collecting patient data, you need to be making sure that you're compliant from a GDPR perspective. The cybersecurity stuff is still in train at the moment, so hopefully not as high a bar on that at the moment, but in future potentially also a separate requirement.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're up to time, so thank you very much for attending. I think it's been a great discussion, very broad ranging. Conscious there's an awful lot there, so if anyone has any follow-up questions, then please do contact one of the panel. But we hope you enjoyed that. Sarah from our marketing team will follow up with some feedback forms, etc. Tell us how can we do things differently in the future topics for events. But thank you very much for attending today. We hope that you'll join our next session, which will be around managing multi-jurisdictional clinical trials later this year. But thank you very much for attending this morning.